Force Academy, and it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Judge Alberto Gonzales.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Texas. I currently reside in Nashville, although I must confess I don't remember Texas weather ever being like this. And because I'm back in my home state, I thought I'd begin with a story that some of you may not know about an old weathered sheep herder, alone with his thoughts out watching his large flock of sheep on a sun-drenched mesa in West Texas, not far from here. And suddenly an unmarked black helicopter flies up and lands nearby. And a man in a dark suit wearing sunglasses and carrying a briefcase gets out and approaches the sheep herder and says in this deep, authoritative voice, "Sir, if I can tell you exactly how many sheep you have out here, will you let me take one with me?" And the sheep herder shades his eyes, studies the man in the suit, and nods his head in agreement. And the visitor opens his briefcase, sets up some sophisticated satellite communications device, downloads imagery and data, and announces with confidence, "You have exactly 167 sheep on this mesa." The sheep herder nodding says, "That's exactly right. Go ahead and take one." As the man prepared to get in the helicopter with the animal, the old sheep herder asked, "Young fella, 1 second before you go, if I can tell you where you're from and who you work for, will you give me my animal back?" And the man in the suit hesitates for a moment but agrees. And the sheep herder says, "You are from Washington, D.C., and you work for the federal government." The man, surprised, agrees and gives the animal back. But before leaving, asks, "Sir, how did you know I was from the federal government in Washington?" Shaking his head, the sheep herder says, 3 things gave you away. First, no one asked you to come, yet here you are. And second, you want me to pay you to tell me what I already know. And third, you know nothing about sheep because the animal you selected is my dog. Now, that story pretty well sums up how most people feel about Washington politicians. I have a little different perspective. For those of you who have been fortunate enough to visit the White House, you probably know that normally there are visitors allowed on the South Lawn to view a Marine One movement, the president's helicopter, and normally there's a bank of news cameras and reporters there to capture historic moments involving the president. On the evening of September 11, 2001, the scene was quite different. Because of the hijackings that morning, everyone had been ordered off the South Lawn, except for a cameraman to record President Bush's arrival from a long day, and a circle of agents in black uniforms with machine guns forming this protected perimeter. And I stood in the Oval Office porch waiting and watching as the president returned home. This was an extraordinary moment in the history of our country, and extraordinary in my own life because I grew up in a time when there were few Hispanic role models. No one who looked like me had ever advised the president as his counsel. In days gone by, no one who looked like me would have been waiting outside the Oval Office to advise the president about the important legal issues that arose that day. And perhaps like some in this room, I grew up poor, raised in a small, modest 2-bedroom home in Houston with 7 brothers and sisters. The boys slept in one room, the girls slept in the other, my parents slept in the living room. We had no telephone until I was a junior in high school, no hot running water the entire time I lived at home. I remember as a boy having to boil water on the stove and carry it in pails to our tiny bathroom to take a bath. Now for some of you, your chapter of the American story undoubtedly begins under similar circumstances. When I was young, most people did not use labels of ethnicity or national origin to convey respect. Members of my family were just called Mexicans. And I remember fidgeting uncomfortably in my junior high school Texas history class, embarrassed to be a Mexican, as my teacher described the legendary acts of men like Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, and Jim Bowie fighting against the tyranny of General Santa Anna and the mighty Mexican army. And I didn't know any better. Somewhere inside me, even back then, I aspired to perform heroic deeds like those Texas heroes. I wanted to be one of the good guys, but I looked like one of the bad guys fighting under the Mexican flag. No one told me that there were Tejanos, Mexican heroes like Juan Seguin and Jose Navarro, also fighting for my beloved Texas. And the shame of how I felt inside and how I feared that others perceived me in that junior high classroom was difficult to understand. But eventually I put these childish thoughts behind me as I grew older And today I understand that all that I've accomplished was in part because of the lessons learned having lived a life proudly as a Hispanic in America. And I also understand that I have been successful because of my faith and the determination and sacrifices of my parents. I've had several remarkable opportunities in my life in public service, and in connection with that service, I'm often asked this question when I travel: what was it like? You know, what was it like to have to drive your car through three Secret Service checkpoints every morning with bomb-sniffing dogs just to go to work? What was it like to have walk-in privileges into the Oval Office, to stand in front of the same ornate wooden desks used by FDR during World War II as he communicated with? It's the same desk used by JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the same desk used by Ronald Reagan as he developed a strategy to end the Cold War. What's it like to stand there and give the President of the United States your best legal advice on terrorism policy, or who he should appoint to the U.S. Supreme Court? What's it like to ride aboard Air Force One, spend the weekend at Camp David, watch the 4th of July fireworks from the Truman balcony of the White House residence? So what was it like? Well, for this lawyer, for this American, it was exciting, humbling, rewarding, every activity, every decision, every moment of every day. Because people travel from all over the world to see this recognizable 18 acres, the most recognizable 18 acres in the world. And I've yet to meet an American who's not in awe the first time they step into the West Wing. It takes your breath away, and why is that? Because the most powerful person in the world is there making decisions on behalf of the American people. The American people look to the President for leadership to take on big challenges, and one of these, of course, is what I really want to talk about today, and hopefully is of some interest to you and your clients and listeners. Our country was founded on the rule of law. We are also a nation of immigrants, and we are a compassionate people. And these fundamental American truths are in tension with one another here, and it's this tension that's frustrated our ability to effectively address this vexing challenge of immigration reform. Our immigration system currently processes and handles hundreds of thousands of immigration cases successfully every year. But I think many Americans believe that our system is inadequate and our immigration strategy is outdated. Every sovereign nation has the authority to determine who can be a citizen and who can lawfully be present within its borders. And today, many Americans believe our federal government has abandoned that responsibility. Now, achieving the right immigration policy has been difficult because, why? We all know the reasons. It impacts families, our foreign policy, our national security, our economy. It affects the very essence of who we are as a country. I approach the subject of immigration reform from the perspective of a grandson of immigrants, as a Hispanic, and the product of this very diverse state of Texas, from the perspective of a father and a member of a large extended family, and finally from the perspective of a former statewide officer of a border state, and as a one-time chief law enforcement officer of this country. But importantly, I also approach this issue from the perspective of someone who worked in the White House during the September 11th attacks and its aftermath. I worry about national security today, about the evolving threats we witnessed recently overseas, because the next attacker, and you've all heard it from experts on television, the next attack is likely to come from a lone wolf, a single individual indoctrinated and trained over the internet. He may speak perfect English. She is likely already within our borders, likely to be either an American citizen or a lawful resident of this country with a legal right to come and go as she pleases. Our government has spent billions of dollars, as we know, enhancing our national security since 9/11. We cannot have true security if we don't secure our borders, and that cannot be achieved under our current immigration practice and policy. Now, admittedly, it's gotten better in the past decade with Mexico, but it remains inadequate in a post-9/11 world when we fundamentally need to know who is in this country and why. And border security against gang members and drug traffickers, and we have failed at a spectacular level in preventing the illegal flow of guns from the United States into Mexico. Now, those who resist tougher border security measures point to recent numbers that indicate illegal immigration has slowed dramatically recently. Some argue it's actually declined, and they claim there's no proof that foreign terrorists want to use our southern border as a gateway into the United States. The real threat, they say, is from people already legally here in America, as I just described. Even so, we can't discount the southern border. Now, as a former Attorney General, I have to say, and as a citizen who believes in the rule of law, I can't condone anyone coming into this country or remaining here in an unlawful status. However, as a father who wants the best for my own children, I understand why these parents risk coming to America, particularly when there's little fear of prosecution. If we want to stop this practice, we should pass and enforce new immigration legislation rather than amend our Constitution to deal with, quote, anchor babies, as some have suggested, or rather than continue a de facto amnesty program on the federal level that's resulted in unfair financial burdens in states like Texas. Now, as the Supreme Court has committed a federal responsibility, and over the past few years there have been a number of immigration-related bills introduced in Congress. Virtually none were comprehensive. Most were smaller, separate bills. Some were substantive, partisan, purely political, introduced with the knowledge that there was no possibility of passage. None garnered enough support to pass both houses of Congress. In 2012, President Obama, as we know, took executive action to provide relief from deportation to some immigrants through the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals initiative. At the time, Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano said that prosecutorial discretion, which is used in so many other areas, is especially justified here. Despite the strong sentiment, however, the policy was recognized for what it was, temporary, subject to rescission, and the source of no substantive rights to the beneficiaries. In his remarks then, President Obama framed the promulgation of the DACA policy as an issue of an executive action in response to a legislative inaction, specifically the defeat of the DREAM Act. The President also said, echoing Secretary Napolitano's words, that DACA is a temporary measure, simply an exercise of prosecutorial discretion in the absence of more comprehensive congressional action. As we know, this new policy was criticized, continues today as we know, that there was no prosecutorial discretion to decline to deport an alien unlawfully present in the United States. But the Obama administration acted by executive fiat and ignored its duty to take care of the laws needed. And that however attractive it might be as a matter of policy, the DACA program violated the proper respect for congressional primacy and lawmaking that should guide executive action. Undeterred by this criticism, last November by congressional inaction, President Obama announced his plans for further immigration reform through additional executive action. And let me just say that what the President did, again, was a reflection of the current impasse in Congress. Unfortunately, while these executive initiatives may have granted a measure of relief, to those few that fall within the purview of the eligibility criteria, they have not represented the best possible avenue for reform in my judgment, which would be a statutory, more comprehensive and permanent solution. Additionally, the very nature of the flexibility embodied in prosecutorial discretion initiative makes it controversial and vulnerable to political challenges, as we see with congressional attempts to defund DACA and to reverse the President's actions through the Department of Homeland Security's appropriations bill. Now, let me be clear about this. As a general matter, I support a President's commitment to address a national problem. That's what I want my President to do. The actions have to be consistent with his duties under the Constitution to faithfully execute our laws. And determining the limits of the President's inherent power to act, however, in the absence of either an express constitutional or congressional grant of authority, it is one of the most difficult challenges in constitutional law to determine an answer. In part, this is because our courts have been inconsistent in defining the scope of the President's inherent authority. Now, some constitutional scholars argue the President has no inherent power, since this would be inconsistent with the concept of a Constitution intended to create a federal government of limited power. Others believe inherent power that allows the President to act as the public needs demands, provided there's no express constitutional prohibitions. Still others believe, as I do, that the scope of the President's inherent power lies somewhere along the spectrum between these two extremes. What is clear to me is that the President may not amend, ignore, or suspend the enforcement of laws simply because he disagrees with the underlying policy. He may, however, legitimately refuse to enforce a law he believes is unconstitutional. And additionally, the courts have generally been inclined to defer to the executive's discretion in executing a law based upon competing policy priorities and budgetary constraints. Furthermore, the truth is often the courts refuse to even hear cases that present a political question like this one, and thus disputes over allocation of power between the elected branches are frequently resolved not in the courts, but in the public arena. Nevertheless, critics, primarily Republicans, continue to assert that President Obama has acted beyond his constitutional authority, and today, as we know, more than half the states, as well as Speaker Boehner and House Republicans, have filed or threatened to file suit against the Obama administration. I'm not here today to predict how those suits are going to come out, whether or not the challenges will be successful. We do know that a federal judge has issued an injunction stopping executive action from moving forward for the time being. I also know that citizens should always welcome good faith challenges to questionable exercise of power by any branch of government, and that Congress has a duty to protect the institutional prerogatives of the legislative branch. However, as I said earlier, I worry that the President's unilateral actions and this litigation will distract from the hard work necessary to find a more permanent and more encompassing solution for our undocumented population. As you know, not too long ago, the U.S. Senate passed a comprehensive bill authored by 8 Republicans and Democrat senators, a gang of 8. This bill, unfortunately, gathered little support in the Republican-controlled House. It now appears fairly obvious, at least to me, that House Republicans do not want to pass any comprehensive bill. Instead, it appears to the extent the House tackles immigration at all, it will do so through smaller, piecemeal legislation, focused first on border security, with triggers that have to be met before other measures will be implemented. Some of us, however, maybe a lonely voice in the wind, continue to advocate for a comprehensive bill precisely because of doubts that members of the Senate and the House have the discipline and the courage to take multiple tough votes to pass standalone bills that cover all of the measures necessary for an effective, comprehensive policy. I understand some Republicans will not support a comprehensive approach because they fear the President will ignore the border security requirements and focus solely on legalization, much like they believe he has failed to fully enforce or implement other laws. While their concerns may be valid, the President's failure to do his job does not excuse the Congress from doing theirs. So what's the way forward out of the current quagmire? Well, as I just mentioned, the Senate already passed a comprehensive bill rejected by the House. And since the Senate version is unacceptable, I'd like to see the House propose a comprehensive alternative. If that's not politically feasible, and I fear it is not, then the House's current approach of piecemeal legislation is an option, provided it is subject to more realistic triggers, and provided further that House members are truly committed to addressing more than border security. What we cannot afford is the status quo. In a post-9/11 world, we need an immigration system that helps us identify who is in this country and why, and also one that supports our economy by attracting and keeping talent and necessary workers. Now, despite strong support from businesses, law enforcement, and the clergy, the political realist in me tells me a comprehensive bill acceptable to the President is not likely in this Republican-controlled House and Senate. However, because I continue to believe a comprehensive approach is the safest and most effective approach, let me just spend a few minutes telling you what I think that policy should be. And probably won't agree with all of the positions in this plan, but basically we do need tougher border security. I do not support a 3,000-mile fence. I think it's a waste of money on natural terrain. Some fencing is appropriate. I think if we need more border agents, we need to be very careful about that. We've deployed a large number already. I would not be opposed to using our National Guard in a support role. Obviously, we need to take advantage of advanced technology, and I think the Obama administration is doing that, but we need to continue to explore ways that we can do that. What about employer sanctions? You know, I think it's not enough to simply go after the immigrant. They come to work, they come to the United States seeking a job, and we have laws that prohibit employers from hiring undocumented immigrants. If we really want to be effective and tough on employer sanctions, then the CEO or the COO of a major needs to go to jail. I promise you that will stop unlawful employment hiring. What about the 11 or so million that are here? My own judgment is that, first of all, we cannot deport 11 million people. Honestly, we discussed this in the Bush administration. I remember being in meetings where we talked about how we would make that happen. There is so little that the federal government can do effectively. We certainly can't deport 11 million people effectively. And so it seems to me what we do is identify and meet certain qualifications established by Congress. The truth of the matter is they provide a service. They support various industries. To ask them to all to leave at one time would devastate certain industries, and I think that would be a tremendous mistake. Obviously, Congress will have to decide whether or not should they pay a fine of some type, should they pay back taxes. Not everyone should be eligible. If you've committed a crime, if you're a national security threat, you don't get to stay. You have to leave. But I have no problem putting people into some kind of temporary legal status. And I think temporary legal status, then I have no objection to them going to the local DMV and getting a driver's license. But to me, it's always appeared to be somewhat strange that someone is in unlawful status and walks into a government office and some kind of government benefit. That has always troubled me. I know there may be some in this room who have a different view of that, but it seems to me that a better approach, let's put people into a lawful status, even though it may be temporary, and then I have no problem in terms of obtaining some kind of government benefit. What about citizenship for these individuals? Quite honestly, I think the issue of citizenship has become terribly politicized. I think a vast majority of undocumented immigrants, at least those that I talk to, do not come into this country to pursue citizenship. They come to pursue a better life. But if the Congress wants to provide some kind of pathway to citizenship, I would be okay with that. The one caveat to that would be is that we need to make sure that they are not advantaged over those who follow the rules and have waited patiently to pursue the American dream. We've got to dovetail. We've got to coordinate how these individuals who came to this country lawfully, how do both of those achieve U.S. citizenship, assuming the U.S. Congress believes that that is the appropriate course of action. I think visas are also a serious issue. By some estimates, over 50% of the people that are here unlawfully came into this country lawfully. That's a big mistake. I remember being in meetings in the Oval Office with President Bush turning to the FBI Director Bob Mueller and asking him, what about these student visa overstayers? Can you track them? And Bob, quite honestly, didn't have a very good answer in these discussions. It's a real challenge, but we need to work with universities, we need to work with employers, we need to work with home countries. We need to do visa overstayers. And if you overstay your visa, I think, and we find you, you're deported immediately, and you're never eligible again to pursue legal status in this country. I think that's how we're going to discourage visa overstayers. About the children, I believe that children who are brought here to this country by the parents, this is the only home they've ever known, I do not believe they should be penalized for the sins of their parents. And so I think that to the extent that, and we've heard many various proposals about this, but we're talking about these kids who go to college, we're talking about kids that go to serve in the military. I have no objection. In fact, I would support that we put them in some kind of legal status. In terms of citizenship, I would support that because I think we're talking about college-educated kids, if we're talking about people who serve our country, those are the kind of people that I would want as my fellow citizens. So those are some of the parameters that I would include. And one final point I'd like to make that is too often ignored, and that is a comprehensive solution is going to cost a lot of money. In the short term, there's going to be immediate costs associated with measures such as increased border security, government reorganization. They're going to have additional bureaucracy to process new workers, individuals seeking to qualify under some type of legal status. And over the long term, if and when these qualified immigrants become citizens, they're going to be entitled to benefits and services that are going to far exceed, probably, the revenue generated by their tax payments. Estimates are that this cost will be in the billions of dollars annually. And if so, how are we going to pay for it? Will we as a country continue to fund government programs through deficit spending? Or are we going to have the courage to cut government spending in other areas? It's important that we ask our lawmakers to confront this very difficult question because their failure to address budget implications on the front end could have devastating effects for this country in the long run. So these are the broad strokes of a policy, I think, built on a foundation of principles that will endure long past our children's generation. And I know this is a difficult issue, but this is why we elect our president and our congressional leadership to deal with these tough problems. We can't afford a patchwork network of state laws governing immigration. You know, polls show today that Americans are more concerned about the economy and the deficit than they are about border and national security. And I understand the desire for economic security. And as a young boy, I watched my mother and father at the kitchen table dividing the bills at the end of each week to decide which to pay. However, if we as a nation deal with immigration in an intelligent manner, our new policies will help our economy and also help our national security. I close by acknowledging that I'm worried about our country. I worry that we forget sometimes that we are America. We have challenges, and the stalemate in Washington can be frustrating. But when I look at my sons and the opportunities they have, opportunities that my father dared not imagine, I'm reminded that America remains the greatest country on the face of the earth. I'm the son of a Mexican carpenter and cotton picker. My dad did not go to school beyond the 2nd grade, and yet I served as the Attorney General of the United States. We live in a country where dreams still do come true. And for this and many other reasons, America is worth fighting for, and America is worth dying for. She is worth a sacrifice, and that's the lesson I try to impart to young Americans all across this nation. Albert Einstein once said there are 2 ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. And ladies and gentlemen, I've chosen to live my life believing the latter. As I said earlier, my mother and father, they picked cotton. They met picking cotton in West Texas. And I look back upon this daily ritual back in here. Now that I'm back in Texas, I'm reminded of this. Every morning was always the same thing. My mom would wake me up before at dawn to have breakfast with my dad. And it was always the same breakfast, eggs and tortillas. And as we ate breakfast, she was always making the same lunch for my dad, beans and tortillas. And she'd put them in this brown paper sack, and then I remember, watching my dad walk down the street to catch a ride to a construction site. That was our daily ritual. Several years ago, when I was working in the White House, my mom came to visit me in Washington. My dad died in my last year in law school. Anyway, we toured the monuments, we visited the museums, just like all the other tourists, but I took her into the Oval Office to see the President of the United States. Now, she had met George Bush several times as governor, but now he's the president, and we're now in the Oval Office. And, it's important for me to do this, to show her, this little woman about 5 feet nothing, what I had accomplished because of her sacrifices and the sacrifices of my father. And at dawn on the last day of her visit, she was up to make breakfast for me just as she had done every morning for my dad before he left for work. Only I wasn't wearing a hard hat and overalls. I had my suit on. I was reporting to the Oval Office to advise the most powerful person in the world. Now think of the wonder that must have filled her heart. She never dreamed of the miracle that I would take her from the cotton fields to the Oval Office. That is the American story. That is God's grace. I believe in America's promise. I believe it for my sons. I believe it for this community. I believe it for you and your families. I believe it for the immigrants seeking a better life. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. And may you continue to bless the greatest country on the face of the earth, the United States. Thank you for having me.
Judge Gonzales is willing to entertain a couple of questions. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask him? Go ahead.
If you could come down to the microphone here, that would be great. So everybody can hear. This was wonderful. I think you brought tears to my eyes. That was fabulous.
I have a question. The last time that I looked, and it might be updated, where the Immigration Service was processing applications from 1994. I don't know, it might be 95 now. You also have...
You sound surprised.
You also have, if you've seen the news, you see the Dreamers, how, in essence, a lot of these kids, they're Americans. They grew up here. They went to school here. They're going to be politically active when and if they can be, and they have been already. How do you reconcile, and you may or may not want to answer this question, how do you reconcile the wing of the Republican Party that says things like, I want my country back, and things, and have such a hostile, they have such an antagonistic view towards Hispanics. If you look at the last presidential elections, you know, what George Bush got in terms of Hispanic votes, McCain was last, Romney was even less, and it doesn't look like it's going the other way. So you have this dynamic of, you have this very ultra-conservative wing that has this propaganda. You have a rising Hispanic population. You have these population of kids, basically, that are going to be politically active one way or another. How do you seem to be a reasonable person. I mean, I heard you know, so that's why I'm asking the question.
To think a large portion of, and I'm a Republican, let me just go ahead and confess that right now. I think that I represent a significant portion of the Republican Party. Obviously, there is a very conservative wing, and we fundamentally disagree, and that's okay. I mean, I suspect for those who are Democrats in here, there is disagreement on certain policies, so that's okay. With respect to, I think for the white population, honestly, there is a fear. I mean, there's a concern that the country is changing in a way that's uncontrollable. They want, to the extent, you know, if something's going to happen, they want it controlled. And that's why I believe that a comprehensive solution is the best way to do this. We have everyone at the table, everyone who has equities in this. People are going to have to give up. Everyone's going to have to compromise. And in order to get some of the things that they want, they have to give up some things. And so, from my perspective, it's fear and ignorance. And, you know, I think that I still believe very much that the Republican, well, the reason George Bush was successful attracting Hispanic votes is because of his message. He was the right messenger, and his tone was right. And also, quite honestly, he came from a border state. He understood the Hispanic community. Did the Hispanic community, did they agree with all of George Bush's policies? No. But they at least believed that he would listen to them, and he would try to understand their concerns. And, you know, I'm hopeful that if the party nominates the right person in 2016, I think, you know, I think that that person can still attract a significant percentage of Hispanic vote. But obviously, running through the Republican primary, that gauntlet will be difficult. But on the other hand, I think running that gauntlet will strengthen the nominee. If I'm a Democrat, I'd be a little concerned that Hillary Clinton would not face that same kind of pressure, that same kind of scrutiny in tough Democratic primaries. So in my judgment, it's probably a good thing, assuming the right person, from my perspective, gets to the primaries. But to answer your question, I think a lot of it's just fear and ignorance, concern about how their country is changing.
Thank you. My name is Cesar Chavez, and no relation. And I just wanted to congratulate you on your career. We share something in common. I was one of the youngest interns, non-U.S. born interns in the White House, worked for your employer's father, President George Bush, great man.
Yes, he is.
And my question is very simple. I was brought here by Eduardo Caballero, another pioneer in television like yourself in politics. When will you run for president? Help you.
Yeah, okay. I have a great story. I wish I had time to tell in terms of. Well, let me tell you. I'll give the short version. You know, every year one cabinet secretary is asked to stay away, and that's our continuity of government program. And in 2007, I was advised by the chief of staff that I would be that person. And so my security detail drives me up to Andrews Air Force Base, and there's this large government plane waiting for me. And a senior member of every federal agency and department is there waiting for me as well, carrying these thick binders of protocols and classified procedures in the event that they have to advise me, and in the event some catastrophe happens at the Capitol. So we're flying around, and you know, I get all these classified briefings, and then I start watching President Bush give his speech, and it suddenly hit me. Oh my God! You know, I've had some pretty big moments before. I've advised Bush during 2 wars and 50 federal state executions, federal and state executions. So, but sitting in there in that plane, it's certainly, I looked around and we would be up to governing a wounded nation if the need arose. And I'm sure it's a feeling felt by every cabinet secretary in that position before and afterwards. And so, fortunately, Bush finishes his speech, leaves the Capitol, ordered back to Andrews Air Force Base. And I tell that story with much more detail to audiences to kind of pull back the curtains about what happens to that person. And I often conclude that story by saying it's the closest I'll ever come to being President of the United States. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much for being here. My question to you is, with the current Congress having control of both the House and the Senate, why isn't Congress actually passing massive reform like they should be to protect the dreamers? I mean, I'm a Latina, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I do think that with the control of Congress, why is it they're just
well, I think
a complete stop.
I think the Republican-controlled Congress could pass a bill. I'm not sure they could pass a bill that would be acceptable to the president. You know, we have to remember, and I know we're frustrated by the stalemate, the founding fathers envisioned it to be difficult for things like this to occur at the federal level. That's why we have checks and balances. And some people in America believe that the federal government should do hardly anything except maybe print money and defend our borders. And so they're quite comfortable with the fact that nothing happens in Washington, D.C. But my short answer to that question is we have the wrong leadership in Congress. And I don't believe people in the Congress respect the president. And when you don't respect someone, it's hard for you to work with that person. You're not willing to compromise. And so we don't have the right, and I'm not just going to blame it on Republicans. I find fault with the president. I mean, he went the first 2 years. He could have pushed something the first 2 years because he had a Democrat-controlled Congress and didn't do it. So I find fault with all of our federal leadership. And I don't think that we should allow them to get away with it. We should put pressure on them to fix this. As I said in my remarks, we elect them to make these tough decisions. The fact that they let politics get in the way, to me, is inexcusable.
I agree. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Just one small question, Judge Gonzales. But before I ask the question, there's one caveat. Please don't announce that you're going to run for president, because I will be one of the first major Democrats that will pledge working for you forever. It's one of the best presentations I've ever heard, and it touched me deeply. This touched me very, very deeply. But having said that, a little question. Would the peaceful legislative for immigration, will that ever equal a full package?
My fear is, of course, the Republicans who are really focused on border security, you know, once they get that passed first, they'll kind of wash their hands and won't care about reforming their visa process, won't care about employer sanctions. They won't care about what we do with 11 million that are here currently undocumented. So that's my concern. I may be wrong about that, but that's why I think a comprehensive bill makes much more sense to approach it that way.
The women and men in this room collectively control most of the Hispanic radio stations in America.
That's why I came.
And we're honored. What would your advice to them be about the role that they should be playing in presenting these options? Because this is obviously a matter that has to be.
Well, I think this is something that we need to keep in America's consciousness in terms of the importance of this, because again, it's about, from my perspective, it's security, it's also the economy. And those are two very, very important issues as far as I'm concerned. And so we just need to keep talking about it. I've done a number of radio interviews already on this issue. I talk about it all the time. I like to talk about it. And even though we may feel like no one's listening, we may feel like no one's paying attention in Washington, I mean, you all carry a very powerful megaphone. And I just need to continue to talk about this issue. Don't get discouraged. Don't get frustrated. You know, just keep pushing it, and eventually something's going to happen. I'm hopeful the 2016 election, as we move towards that, that's going to be progress. But if not, we're going to have new leadership in the White House. We may have new leadership in the Congress. That may be another opportunity. This is a tough issue. I get that, and so we have to be patient. But we shouldn't be lenient on our leaders in Washington. This is why they're there. Okay, thank you.